If you're watching this video, congratulations. The US government has declared you part of a terror network. Just how is the US president rolling out the language of terrorism to target beliefs that are so common that the majority of Americans hold them? I'm Paul, US Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Winning a war is actually pretty boring. Repetitive training, careful budgeting, diligent maintenance all make the difference between victory and defeat. But commanding a military at war in today's sponsor, Supremacy World War III, is completely different. Supremacy World War III is a free online PvP strategy game set in modern global conflict. It's a massive game where each world has over 99 players and over 100 unique units, from fighter jets to airborne infantry. You'll compete in wars that can go on for weeks, and it's up to you to decide if you want to join powerful alliances, antagonize rivals, or even betray your friends. Like real war, you need to build and research the right military to stay on top. There's a huge tech tree with over 250 different technologies to give your military the edge. I love that it's cross-compatible on PC and mobile, so you can play the same game on the same account whether you're at home or slacking off at work. For the next 30 days, you can use my link in the description, and Supremacy World War III will hook you up with a limited time unit, the Bomber. So click the link in the description, choose your nation, and fight your way to victory. Now, this is, of course, a not that covered memorandum called the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. Now, these are generally strategic directions provided to the national security apparatus. And this, for context, for example, is usually done for things like changes to our nuclear posture. A national security presidential memorandum authorized the NSA to collect sweeping amounts of data about U.S. Citizens' internet and phone activities, right, in the early 2000s. So these are not minor executive orders, transferring one thing to another. This is a broad steering of the entire ship of the national security apparatus. And so when you see this, you assume it's in response to a pressing, dangerous, emergent threat, right? The United States after 9/11, the emergence of the Soviet Union after the Cold War, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These are major national security events that require a whole of government pivot. So what exactly has happened that has warranted this? Well, the answer is, of course, Trump's favorite podcaster got killed, right? Now, at first, I want to be clear. The death of Charlie Kirk is tragic, but the response seems to be completely unhinged because the administration has now shifted the entirety of the national security apparatus to focus on what they call dismantling networks that are domestic terror networks. Now, I want to be clear. The FBI has released zero evidence that the individual who killed Charlie Kirk was part of any kind of network. And even the president himself in this memorandum admits that there's not a true network in the sense that you and I understand it, right? It's not like Al-Qaeda where there was bin Laden at the top and a bunch of terrorists below him. Instead, he argues that the actual network is ideas, that individuals advocating for the wrong kind of ideas or having the wrong kind of beliefs are passively encouraging this kind of violence. Now, this is best thought of as unbelievably insane because in the United States, we have this pesky thing that keeps stopping our poor joint terrorism task forces from arresting all kinds of anti-government people. And it's the First Amendment, the part that says that you're actually free to hold a wide variety of beliefs as long as you literally aren't advocating for actual imminent violence, right? So what are some of those beliefs that the US government has said, hey, if you hold these beliefs and you publicly express them, you are at least believed to be part of a broad terror network. You are contributing to what they call left-wing terrorism. Right-wing terrorism, for the record, guys, doesn't exist. You might recall that some allege that the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol might have been an example of right-wing terrorism. And for example, of the 140 U.S. Capitol police officers that were injured in that, including an officer injured who suffered a traumatic brain injury, one officer who was pepper sprayed and then died of strokes within 48 hours, one officer suffered a heart attack, a concussion, and traumatic brain injury. One officer, of course, had his head smashed against a door, and a rioter attempted to gouge out his eye. But those individuals were not, the individuals who participated in January 6th, those were not terror attacks, okay? The U.S. government pardoned those people. They were completely innocent. They were just tourists. And all of those Capitol police officers that were injured, it was not part of a terror network. Only left-wing people, according to this memorandum, can participate in terror networks, right? And what are the beliefs of this sprawling terror network? Well, the answer is things that are unbelievably common among Americans, right? So, for example, they include anti-Christian, right? One, they say that these beliefs are against democratic institutions, against constitutional rights, and against fundamental American liberties. But of course, they say anti-Americanism, which, of course, as we know, to this administration means you're against the president, right? Because, of course, like Xi Jinping's China and Putin's Russia, of course, the president is the state, right? So being anti-Trump is being anti-American. It also includes anti-capitalism. So if you have a problem, for example, with the current tax rate of billionaires, including the richest man in the world, Larry Ellison, Trump supporter, and the second richest man in the world, Elon Musk, also strident Trump supporter, well, you may be part of these terror networks. Well, how many Americans, for example, believe that billionaires could stand to pay a little bit more taxes? Well, in recent polling data, right, the question, do you think the federal government should pursue policies that reduce the wealth gap between the richest and poorest Americans? Most Americans, 55%, said, yeah, you should. And do you think the federal government should or should not try to reduce the share of wealth held by billionaires in this country? 49% said they should, right? With a margin of error of 4%, easy. Most Americans believe that. Do you think billionaires are taxed too high, too low, or just right? In fact, something like nearly 60% said it is somewhat or much too low. Boy, if you agree with any of those statements, congratulations. The U.S. government can investigate you as part of a terror network. But what about anti-Christian beliefs? Why, according to most surveys, in fact, if you think that public school should teach about all religions equally or not teach anything about religions, you might be part of this anti-Christian extremists, right? If you are part of the 50% of 26% of Americans that think that religion plays too much of a role in public school, you might be part of these extremists. So you can see that there are huge swaths of the United States, right? In another one, when asked, do you think the U.S. is a Christian nation? By the way, the U.S. government's official stance is that yes, the U.S. is a Christian nation. 44% of Americans, only 44% of Americans would agree with that statement. The other 34% say it's definitely not, and 22% not sure. So you can see how common beliefs end up putting you in the same category as many of these terror networks, right? In fact, if you are critical, as a majority of Americans are, and disapprove of the Trump administration's program to find and deport immigrants in the U.S. illegally, 51% of Americans disapprove of that. Congratulations, you're also part of the terror network. Now, the problem is not so much that, as we've seen in this is the same legal infrastructure that was deployed to counter terror networks in the U.S. in the 2000s and 2010s that were part of Islamic extremism. And these, to be clear, have a vastly higher amount of violence, total body count, than any of the so-called left-wing violence, right? For context, you had 9/11, you had the Pulse nightclub shooting, you had the Fort Hood shooting, you had the San Bernardino shootings, you had a huge collection of violence perpetrated by these networks. And the U.S. said, okay, well, we are going to look at individuals who might be advocating a sort of pro-Islam, anti-American beliefs. Those beliefs, by the way, protected by the Constitution. And then we're going to use those as a starting point to dig in to see if there is more terrorism type activity happening around them. That's why the joke is that every mosque in New York and New Jersey had at least one FBI informant in it in the 2000s and 2010s. But there's some truth to that. So the problem is that what you have now is that 51% of Americans can now be investigated and dug into to see if they're part of a terror network, right? Or maybe they just didn't file their taxes right. Or maybe they have a little too many parking tickets. Or who knows what the government will find once they start trying to dismantle the terror networks. And they also point out that it's not, you may say, well, I'm not a member of any of these sort of groups, right? I'm not a member of a Freedom from Religion Foundation. I'm not a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I don't advocate for anti-American, anti-Trump beliefs. But as this very thing points out, is that if you participate in an anonymous chat forum, an in-person meeting, a social media, even in an educational institution, and you discuss these things, congratulations, you are, again, part of this terror network. And the Joint Terrorism Task Forces can now investigate you. So this is something that, again, a country with a functioning immune system, for lack of a better term, Congress or a court would come in and say, this is unacceptable. Even the bureaucracy itself, the national security apparatus, would say, no, you cannot simply tell us to investigate these incredibly broad-based beliefs. And the fact that literally no one is a sign of just how deep the rot in the U.S. institutions is, right? Just like an old 80-year-old person, right, with like a leukemia, right, a cancer rotting their immune system. It means that when infections happen, when there's nothing to fight, and that, I think, is the real indictment of kind of the U.S. system right now, is that the president seems able to wantonly do brazenly illegal things, and no institution seems willing to sustainably stand up and push back, right? Even the only one we've seen do so in a reliable way is actually the courts. But this is where things get kind of disturbing, is that yesterday, the home of a judge in South Carolina who ruled against one of President Trump's many directives of questionable legal merit, had her home burned down in an apparent explosion. And many people are critical because, of course, Stephen Miller, White House Chief of Staff, has repeatedly characterized these judges' rulings as protecting left-wing terrorists, right? They says, quote, it's shielded by far-left Democrat judges. This was posted just hours after the attack, right? He says, quote, there's a large growing movement of left-wing terrorism in this country. It is well organized and funded, and it is shielded by far-left Democrat judges, prosecutors, and attorneys general. The only remedy is to use state power to dismantle terrorism and terror networks. And, of course, this is obviously, again, if this were a left-wing politician saying these things about right-wing judges, for example, this memorandum would authorize that person to be investigated as enabling terrorism. But when you're Stephen Miller and you say, no, it's the left who's bad, you get a pass. You're actually the White House Chief of Staff. And so this, I think, is the fundamental reason why we cannot take this administration and its efforts to reframe reality seriously. We have to always go back to what is actually true. And again, a lot of civil liberty people had real problems with creating this terrorism framework, this ideologically driven terrorism framework that said that the investigation is predicated on protected beliefs, and then we see if there's crimes that happen inside of it. Much like, conducting a traffic stop, cop pulls you over for a busted taillight and then finds drugs in the car. Well, the cop, you have to be investigated for a real reason. And if the whole point, again, of an amendment in the Constitution says the government can't just come in and investigate you and search your property and your history and your phone. They can't just do it because they want to. They have to have probable cause of a crime. But now what we've done is created the situation in which investigations, a sort of they've created this probable cause is simply believing that billionaires should be taxed more, that we shouldn't be pushing Christianity in public schools. And no, will this amount to anything? Maybe, maybe not. But the problem is that the framework exists so that when the administration wants to crack down on you, wants to go after you for voting the wrong way or for free speeching a little too hard on your Twitter account or your social media, they have the framework to do it, right? They, just like any other sort of violation of the Constitution or individual rights, you don't do it. You don't wake up one day and do it, right? You normalize it. You normalize it by first saying these beliefs on Twitter. For example, the president recently posted an image calling the Democratic Party the party of Satan. Then you create the legal framework around it. Then you actually implement and charge people through that framework. Usually, you start with people who are very, very extreme. So in the case of, for example, Putin's Russia, the first people targeted with the laws they passed that forbid Russians from criticizing the Russian military in any way, shape, or form, they targeted extremist activists, right? Pacifists and the like. But then once they proved and demonstrated they were willing to use this in court, then you saw prosecutions against teachers. Sometimes even teachers that made comments as flippant as it's a tragedy that so many Russians have been killed in this war. That alone got them arrested and jailed. This is how these processes work. So again, I hope that I don't look back and go, I told you so. But unfortunately, it feels like that is the direction that the administration has already committed to moving.